Hey, Tim, I'm looking to see that we've decided to go from some of the human interest podcasts that we've been doing to something a little more technical today. Is that what you're thinking as well?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you some questions about change on major projects, and I thought that would be um, a good transition from some of the things that we've been talking about lately.
No, I agree. Although being Mr. People First Project Management, I kind of like the topics that we have been doing up until now. But no, this is an important one. And I know, in fact, if I recall back from when I was introduced to this whole process of, I know we were talking about change management today.
Mhm.
When I was introduced to this whole process of why we do change, it was on a fairly large project early on in my career. I wasn't the project manager, but I was working my way up into team leadership. Excuse me. And the day before we went live, our senior programmer decided that he did not like the way the menu structure was set up on, you see where this is going, don't you?
Yeah.
He didn't like the way the menu structure was set up, so he made some changes at around midnight. The next morning, fortunately, we did not have the newspaper people there, but the next morning, with all sorts of pomp and circumstance, we had the major sponsor there, users there. They go to sign on and nothing worked because they couldn't bring up the main menu to get the project started.
Oh,
All
that's
because
bad.
someone decided that they would make a change that didn't go through any change management, change control processes.
Oh, that hurts. That hurts.
It hurts.
Yeah, I haven't had the deep career you've had, but I've had the broad career, and I've had a couple game stoppers like you. But what's funny is, um, even in business, in operations, change is something that's critical. When you're making a change inside of a restaurant, it's like, okay, here's the change. Let's talk about it. Yeah, that's a good change. Okay, let's approve it. Okay, it's approved. It's such a controlled thing that you don't want to interrupt the business of something that's working well.
Well, exactly. And, they always say change is inevitable, right? I mean, they always say that change is a constant. I think we just need to live with that at some point.
Yeah, and we have to adapt some way to that's the role of project management, isn't it? To ensure a higher probability of success through governance and control and monitoring and proper implementation of planning. That's the hope. And without change, you cannot really provide that probability of success otherwise.
Well, let me go one step further. Maybe this is a little facetious, but without change, we don't have jobs.
That's right. That's right.
What, who would hire someone to just kind of run something that's not changing? It's just kind of
Yeah.
on autopilot, right?
Yeah. And break fix has a limited capacity for not just personnel but for skill set. And this is why business adopted project management in the first step, because business understands that we're under a constant state of change.
Well, and if you really think about it, the example that I used, which was a true story. By the way, it took us almost a day to recover from that. So we ended up launching the next day. And, we laughed about it afterwards, but it was kind of a small disaster at the time. It was a major project for us as a fledgling firm at the time. So when I looked at that, in terms of the change control processes you need in place, this was a programmer who decided on his own to make the change. There was nothing that went through myself as team leader or our project manager or our VP or our project sponsor or anyone else. So it's one of those things that if you're going to do something, anything that changes the experience of the end user in any way, shape, or form, there needs to be a formalized process.
So that leads me to ask you, in a major project, I want to be aware of change before it happens. I want to know what the sources of change are. So on the projects that you facilitate, um, where do you expect change to occur from?
In my experience, because I work largely with government, state government, local government, a couple of federal projects as well. Much of that comes from regulatory changes. And here's the secret. When they bid out a project, when they meaning governments or any organization, when they bid out a project and it is awarded, in my experience, they were always fixed price, fixed schedule, fixed end date projects. That didn't mean that someone off in the legislature or someone off in a regulatory body or someone off in central office with procedures didn't need to make some change that interrupted the requirements that you were working towards. So typically, in my experience, it's come from the client side, from something along the lines of legislative or regulatory or some policy or procedure change.
Wow, wow. So that's big. And if you're bidding under fixed contract, that means that if you have a change, you as the seller are going to bear the cost of that change, aren't you?
No, no,
Thank you.
because we have it written in our contracts that any change that comes from without, actually even changes initiated by us that are necessary, have to be looked at, prioritized, considered, and if allowed or if approved to go forward, then they are paid for according to the project stipulations. So let me ask you something, Tim. Have you ever heard of something called, let's see, it was it was affectionately known as Obamacare?
Uh-huh.
So right in the middle of one of our state health and human services projects, Obamacare was enacted. I think that changed a few things for us in the middle of the project.
Oh, I was out of government contracts at that time, but I was seeing how Obamacare and then the Affordable Care Act and all the transitions and all these things that the states had to do to, number one, build the systems, and then number two, change the systems. I could not. There were some great white papers that came out of that, cautionary tales of how you actually navigate something like that.
And I will say, and this is through no lack of, or this is through not sort of some braggadocious way of looking at this, but the projects that I worked on that were affected by the Affordable Care Act, we had very, very stringent change control processes in place, such that yes, they did affect our cost. Yes, they did affect our timelines, meaning the client, but they did not interrupt what we ended up giving to the end user. And that was a finished product with Affordable Care Act changes in it.
Wow. And to our audience out there, we're not talking about simple changes. We're talking about megalithic enterprise changes that impact multiple state organizations. So if you're looking at a complex system, these things are horrendous.
Yeah, exactly. You're building a Toyota Corolla and suddenly someone comes in and says, you know what, this needs to be a Lexus.
That's exactly right. So you have a Toyota Lexus.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So changes can basically come from everywhere. I've had a lot of changes where the sales rep actually has a deep relationship with our client, and the sales rep makes commitments to the client, or the sales rep goes to my engineering team and says, hey, just do this. It won't cost anything. It's just a couple days. and just like your initial story, the engineer, user interface change, great. But the problem is when we make changes in these projects, we may take hours, if not days, to sort out what this really does impact.
Well, and your example is exactly right, because the expectation is that you will absorb it in the project team. And sometimes it does affect well, often it affects the schedules. And if you want to keep the cost from varying, sometimes you end up having your development staff or your analytical staff work overtime or work weekends, and it just becomes an unfair process to people who have lives outside of the office.
Right, right. And this is the problem. The risk and the reward that one of my mentors was brilliant in this. When you have somebody getting a reward in some type of transaction, they're taking on the risk.
Yeah.
But when you have something like scope creep, somebody's getting the reward of that change and somebody else is taking on the risk.
Yeah.
And so as a project manager, I've found that if you can actually associate the acceptance of the risk along with the acceptance of the reward as a single package, people are more conscientious about how they request and suggest their changes.
Oh, absolutely. I've, your salesman story reminded me of one in which we had very similar, but from client staff. A lot of times what we'll do is we will embed within the project team staff from my team or from our development team and from the client team, so that we all look like one team. We're co-located. It just makes a whole lot of sense. Well, often that co-location creates incredible deep relationships, deep friendships, especially in a project that's going well. And wouldn't you know it, often a client feels like, I never thought of this, but if we could just have this one change here, that would help me in my job when we implement. And we have an analyst or a programmer says, that makes a lot of sense. Yes, I will do that. So it doesn't have to come from the salesperson. It can come from just a wonderful relationship within the team itself. And I've seen that happen more often than once.
Yes, yes, good relationships and good intentions. And nobody stops to think, because to stop something like this is to stop innovation. And everybody adores innovation.
Well, and people don't like to hurt someone else's feelings either. She asked me so nicely. Why wouldn't I do it for her, right? But by the way, there are legitimate times that staff on our development side have brought forward changes to the client and had them accepted. For example, if they're in the middle of something and suddenly it dawns on someone that this could be done much more efficiently if we just did this, it doesn't mean that we have to do that, but we are obligated to take that forward to the client and said, we can save you a lot of money. Maybe not in developing this, but certainly in the long run, if we do this change. So we are obligated also as developers, not to be self-serving and line our pockets, but truly be client service oriented, such that the changes that we offer them are useful changes for their eventual benefit.
Yeah, yeah, and one of my favorite authors, W.E. Deming, would pat you on the back right now. It's all about the value, and it's all about giving somebody something of value.
Yeah.
So early on, you were talking about change in these major projects having to be formal and having to be pretty rigorous. What does a change management system look like in a project of your scale?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, the words you used were formal, and they have to be very formal. And when I say formal, I mean that means lots of signatures, all the way up. And one of the things that the teams that I worked with got in the habit of documenting changes, even if they were small, and even if they were considered no cost change requests, because you always want to have your documentation current. You always want to have a record of why you changed something. But in terms of that formalized process, first of all, the statement of change was delivered to us. Now, if a client is giving me or my team a statement of change, they don't necessarily know how to detail it out, but they can put it in their user language and say,
Right.
this is the change I need.
Right. Right.
So usually it starts with a request, a formal request on and typically we use a template so that the template always looks the same. They always know how to fill out the form, especially in
Right.
government projects. They love to fill out those forms. But I
Okay.
think along with that statement of change, that description, we also typically ask for something like, well, if this change were to be approved, when does it need to be implemented? So if it's during the development of a project, it would be sometime during that time. But if we're in maintenance and operations, it could be delivered by a date certain, for example, and then also a priority put forward on that. Is that similar to what you've experienced as well in some of your projects?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a formal input, a formal request. Now, I include two other things as inputs into the formal change process.
Okay.
Number one, besides the change request itself, are like unapproved changes. There has to be a system to insert them into the formal system. And
Yeah.
then there's something called necessary change,
Right.
where that's where the federal government says this law has been changed, and so your project must also change. And that's not a change request per se. It's basically a change order, but it's what we call a necessary change. So I tend to have these three categories that I try to focus on.
Yeah, we have in my description where we have the change request, besides that date certain that we asked them for, we would also ask them for exactly what you suggest. Is this a mandatory change because of regulation, legislation, whatever? Or is it a necessary change based on something that may bring efficiency to the program or something along those lines, but may not have to be done date certain? And then there are some changes that, as you're working through something, are nice to have. You don't want to lose sight of them, but they're not necessarily high priority. So you still want to document them.
Right.
You may not go through a formal estimation process just yet because they are not high priority, but you don't want to lose that at some point.
Yeah, they're your deferred changes, or not today.
Not today, right?
So what you're doing is, by doing it this way, you're actually creating an automatic process of prioritization, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what happens, that prioritization isn't necessarily final, because that request for change goes to the project team, and the project team then takes its time to look at the effect of that change on time, on the schedule, on effort, on cost, on other deliverables, on perhaps deliverables that are already passed and have already been approved that need to be resurrected and changed. So all of that estimation, all of that impact statement then gets formalized against that change request as well. And a new priority may be, for example, if someone brings me a change request thinking this is $50,000 and my estimation comes out and says it's $200,000, they may say, oh, low priority. Because that could change the priority.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, this is very similar to how I would look at it, and how I have looked at it. I tend to have one change control system. If the client has their own change control system for their organization, their operational processes, I try to adopt that. What's your feeling about that? And what's your approach?
Yeah, very similar. Anything that I can do for the client to keep things the same in their mind, even if it's a different log of changes, because it's specific to the project versus to the organization. If I can make it look very much to their experience, then it's a lot easier to bring that forward to the change control board meetings, which we haven't talked about yet. It's a lot easier to kind of show them your estimation process, the impact process, and all of the kinds of information they need to make a decision. They meaning the client.
Okay, very good, very good. Yeah, you just mentioned change control board. Let's go there, because a lot of my students don't work on the projects that have a formal change control board. They have governance. They have authorizations and signatures that they have to in place, but they don't have a change control board. What does that look like for your type of projects?
Well, for my type of projects, again, a formal process typically meets on some cadence. A lot of times it's weekly, depending on the frequency or the velocity of change, or they can meet monthly if they're in a maintenance and operations, saying, okay, let's look at what the release pattern is going to look like for next month's maintenance or enhancement. So they set up a cadence. And when I say they, it typically involves senior people within the organization who have the decision-making capacity for any kind of change. Typically, we would bring in representatives, senior representatives from all of the functional areas that could be affected. Because if I'm dealing with payroll and someone else is dealing with inventory, and I've only got so much capacity, whose change is more important, the payroll one or the inventory one? I don't want my project team to make that decision. I want the senior staff on the change control board to kind of duke it out amongst themselves and make the priority decision as to which one goes forward this month and which one waits till next month.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I've used the change control board mostly for technical changes, like building a data center, where if you push out a wall 2 feet, they're going to have to go in and help you with, well, that's going to ruin that gas line and you're going to reroute the data this way. I haven't worked on operational and functional change control boards so much, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, and of course the description I just made, we went from a single change in its path into, through the request process to the estimation process, et cetera. But what we're dealing with on the change control board is a number of changes that have accumulated, and maybe there may be 5 changes on the change log, or there may be 500 changes on the change log. Someone has to prioritize those and put forward the ones that the project team is going to work on. And again, based on mandatory or some sort of as necessary or some sort of nice to have, they get prioritized, and cost becomes a big factor in that as well.
Right. Okay. So here we have approved or rejected or deferred, and then they go to be implemented. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and I've tried to ensure and build in the discipline of validation of changes as well, and that's a lot of responsibility of the team to go back and say, yep, we put the change in, and yep, we got the result we expected. And that's a big thing. Like that's where one of the hiccups that you were talking about with your story at the beginning. If you're working on one of these huge enterprise systems, you got to have that validation in place.
Well, and that's the other thing. And if there's young budding project managers who are listening to us today, and I know there are, when you develop these change estimates, one of the things that often escapes people who have more of a technical bent is, what is the effect of this change on the user documentation, on the training materials and the training that gets put out to the end users every so often? What is the effect on the technical documentation? What is the effect on perhaps organizational change management? Did you estimate for not just testing, as you mentioned, validating the change, but did you in fact look at regression testing so that the change you just put in didn't affect other components of the system that were working fine, but now may have been affected by this change? So there's all of these other aspects of change that aren't just the functional or the hardware or the software change that you're putting in, but in fact may affect other components that with the unintended consequences piece, you have to test for that as well and put that into your estimates.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Here's a question I get from a lot of my students. Who manages changes and who approves changes? Is this something that you as a project manager can delegate on these big projects?
I've had all sorts of experience, and I'd like to kind of compare it to yours as well. But I've been in situations where myself as project manager and my project control office, typically I'll have 2 or 3 people who manage the schedule and manage the costs and that sort of thing. I delegate to them to ensure that the changes are slotted in correctly, not incorrectly, are slotted into the schedule correctly. I've also, though, worked with client organizations that have hired a PMO or have an internal PMO, project management office within the organization that looks at change control across its entire, all of its projects. So the full gambit of projects that the organization is responsible for. So from my perspective, it's a project management office type duty, but it could be handled by the development team, or it could be handled by the client team. Or in one case I was involved in, they hired an outside force to do nothing but manage the project for them, including change control.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I've tried to keep compliance and the people approving the change sort of separate to create a separate set of eyes.
Yeah.
People who approve and apply the change, and then somebody else who can come in. Again, we're getting into quality assurance here when you're getting into validation. And I know we're starting to climb into this whole thing of governance and compliance. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, it's tricky.
Well, it is.
You wish you can just have a plan for change, and you do have a plan for change at the beginning, but you also agree that this plan is going to change as you understand the work and the stakeholders and the environment.
Well, that's exactly right. And then one of the things that you asked me about in terms of working with a change control board in some of these large organizations, I've worked with, for example, in government organizations where they were skittish, almost overly cautious, to the point where decisions were difficult to come by.
Mm-hmm.
So those were difficult situations. I've also worked in situations where they had an overly, not aggressive, but sort of overly detailed, overly informed. They want to know, basically, they want an education in systems integration to be able to make a decision on whether or not they should make a change to a screen. So I've dealt with both of those kinds of organizations. And to me, the easiest ones to work with are when they have a experienced group of people who do nothing but manage change.
Yeah. And if you have ever been around people who are experts in change, they look at things differently. They actually understand certain concepts. We won't delve into this right now, but one of the things that you're talking about is people who are risk averse. When you're talking about approving a change, you're talking about accepting the risk.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are not willing because they don't know how to do a proper risk analysis, and they have not had experience or worked with people who have a firm grasp on how to quantify, analyze, reserve, and create a appropriate response for risks. And in the end, any decision is not going to be 100% probable, and a lot of people are never going to be comfortable with that.
That's true. And I've also, and this is again for our young project managers who haven't necessarily experienced this before, but I've also been in situations where the client organization has been very malleable. Now, it gives for good relationships on the project, but it's one of those things, well, if you say so, let's do it. Well, no, I don't want to be responsible for putting forth your change request priorities. I want you to make that decision, not just if I say so, because quite frankly, I don't know your business or organization as well as you do. And so sometimes I think the malleable people are almost as scary to work with as those who are overly detailed and want to know everything.
So, yeah, so what you're saying is in some projects as a risk, as a project manager, you're going to have to say, let's make that decision and put a sense of urgency behind it and say, you're going to accept risk. And with another project in another environment, you're going to say, let's pump the brakes here and let's really understand what we're saying here and let's look at the alternatives. And as a project manager, you have to be ready for both those alternatives.
And what you just said is key. Don't just assume, if you have one of those situations, especially the malleable one, don't just say, wow, I've got permission to do what I want. No, never. You've always got the client's best interest at heart. And if that is not in their best interest, you need to help them pump the brakes and say, let's discuss this. Before you just accept what I say, let's discuss this.
It's a conscious activity to analyze. You have to make a decision to think about things before you act. We have 100,000 years of hard wiring in our brain that says act, 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 and it's kept us alive. And it's only in the last, few millennia that we've really developed this front of our brain that says, pump the brakes, let's slow down. And we should actually take more advantage of that.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question in terms of your experiences in these areas. So if you did, I take it you have not worked on as many fixed price projects?
Actually, I've worked on quite a few. I've probably had about 95 projects in my life, and 2/3 of them have been fixed price.
So if you're looking, well, I guess either way, fixed price or time and materials, whichever way it is, though, there's not an endless supply of money. So how did you handle situations where the change requests came forward? Did the client share their budget with you, or did you know, or did you just kind of estimate on their behalf and then let them make a decision based on some secret budget that they controlled somewhere in a back room?
I always had that triple constraint discussion. Real quickly, here's the request, and here's the cost, and here's the benefit. And by the way, if you do this, here's the impact to the schedule, and here's the impact to the scope too. Yeah, you're increasing the scope, you're increasing the schedule and budget as well. And I'd always throw in risk and quality too. And that was an active discussion, not just part of the analysis. And by constantly, setting expectation that whenever we have a change, we're going to discuss it in this way, I almost had an informal or a tacit understanding of change, creating just a constant culture of change, not just creating a formal change system. But it was the long road. This takes weeks, if not months, to ingrain in the culture of your stakeholders and team.
So whether the client revealed their full budget to you or did not, you still went about doing your job in terms of estimating cost, schedule, impact, and then help them make the decision. And even if they didn't reveal their budget to you, at least they had the facts as to whether or not they should go forward with that change or not, right?
Yeah, whether that black box was exposed to us or not, they had everything they needed to make the decision on their side. And more often than not, they were not in a mood to analyze. They came to me have made the decision. So what would usually happen on bigger projects when we were doing some transition work, they would say, okay, why don't you guys stop work because we have to go and talk inside. And they had realized that they were going in a different direction than what they had told us. This is where things get scary.
Yeah.
You're right. This opens up a whole Santa Claus bag of risk that you have to bring internal while they're doing their work. Your diligence is to say, okay, how big is this and what's going on that could further decimate this project?
Which is why I, as a project manager, especially as I became more senior as a project manager, I invited my client to let me in on some of their inner discussions so that I could help them with a lot of those sorts of decisions. I could help them much quicker if I knew the direction they thought they were going, and if my team was going in a different, I could help them much quicker and get my team back on track or get them back involved. But they had to let me in on some of what they were dealing with on the inside.
Yeah, I remember working with a peer. She was working with a paper mill company, and they wanted to do some data center work. And she was very concerned about how they made decisions and that kind of thing. And she said, Tim, can you help these guys out? And we discussed budget and time and all that. And I figured I could be a financial analyst on that project. And it took my organization committing to pay for me to travel, spend 3 days with the project manager and the team to justify why they needed to add me to the project. And it was a huge risk that we spent. But in the end, he not only added me, but he gave me 3 financial analysts from his company's finance organization. And this is, when you're spending 10 to 30 million dollars, I commend this project manager for pushing back, but I really commend my friend for being able to hold her own and say, this is, no, seriously, we need this as something that's transparent.
Yeah. Well, one of the, I don't know if it was, I guess it was sort of a aha moment for one of my government clients, because typically what they would do is they would enter into these large fixed price, fixed length of time deals with a contractor. And then when an unanticipated change came forward, they had to go back to the well. Each time there was an unanticipated change, they had to go back to the well. Well, in government circles, once you appropriate funds, people don't like it when you come back to the well, because sometimes that affects budgets in other departments. They have to move money around. It's not a comfortable situation. So one of the procurements in which I was working on to advise in an advisory capacity to advise the procurement officers, we ended up asking them to set aside a percentage of the full contract cost for unanticipated changes. Didn't mean it had to be revealed to the contractor in terms of, this bucket of money that they would naturally then want to go after.
Right.
But it was there as a set aside. And then what happened was every time there was an unanticipated change, we already had an allocated set of funds that could be used or didn't have to be used, but it was there available so that we wouldn't have to keep interrupting the flow of the project to go back and ask for more allocation.
Yeah, that's called management reserve. You build your reserve estimates for your identified risk. And on these major projects, the project managers I worked with, the real smart ones, would always have this discussion with the decision makers and say, okay, construction accidents, those are going to happen. We're going to have problems where we have change in technology and we have to adopt the new tech. So we're going to have that, like you said, a separate account set aside for unanticipated changes.
Did you have a rule of thumb?
No, actually, the best company that actually managed reserve the best, they used it as an estimate of the impact to the business. Like, how much is it going to cost the business if we don't do this, or we don't do this in time, and push it out? And so they'd have it as a revenue and a profit projection that it's going to be a cost, and they basically offset that cost with the reserve. How's that for an answer?
That's good.
Yeah, that's
We had,
I thought I've never seen that before, and I thought, you know, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, I've worked with governments where they set aside a certain percentage, let's say 10% or 15%. And that was just kind of like, if someone bid $10 million, then there was $1 million or 1.5 million set aside.
Right.
And they're
And
just available.
that's not a bad deal too.
Yeah.
When you get to identified risks, you want to treat them differently though. You don't want to
Yeah.
have such buffer estimates, rough
Yeah.
order estimates. You want to get those risks, and their response is really tight. But from a management reserve, yeah, I don't want to say 10% is a good estimate, but if you're doing that, at least you have something.
Something, yeah. Now think about this from the system integrators perspective, the contractors or the IT organization's perspective, where you're running the risk on it. Let's say it's a fixed price deal. I had one manager, a senior vice president type person, who had a unique way of looking at this. His thought process was, if I'm going to run into true trouble on this project where I get a delay that I can't control, but neither can I pin it on the client, because it's one of those things that happen. For example, user acceptance testing gets delayed or something along those lines. My biggest exposure, this is his thinking, my biggest exposure is during my highest ramp up. So typically, if you think of a project that's, let's say it's waterfall, whatever it is, but typically you would, especially in a waterfall project, you would ramp up through the analysis. Finally, you would hit your peak during development. So he would take his peak and he would add 1 or 2 months of peak development effort and say, let's say I get delayed 2 months. I want this in my reserve.
Okay, that's not a bad way of looking at it either.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty smart.
I suspect it's a little different in Agile because you've got the sprints that you're kind of running at some sort of capacity all the way through. But certainly in the waterfall, where there's this huge ramp up and ramp down, I thought it was a very clever way of mitigating his risk as to some sort of delay that you couldn't kind of point the fingers as to whose fault it was and therefore who should pay.
Right. Very good. Very good. Okay. You brought up something very interesting. Agile. How do you manage change in Agile?
This I'm still learning this part, because my history being one of large waterfall fixed price projects. I am actually advising on an Agile project right now from a functional point of view. But here's what I'm learning, and see if this meets what your thought process is. We've got the sprint process going, and it's a nice cadence. It's a 2-week cadence. It's working very well. The system integrator keeps 2 sprints worth of backlog user stories ready to go, so that when one sprint is finishing, the other one is getting ready to start and the capacity is already built. So a lot of times from a change request process, it's almost like there is no change, because if something gets delayed in one of the sprints, it just gets pushed back to the backlog and then brought forward again into a future sprint. So from that perspective, and very much the development effort has been kind of evened out. And eventually, when we go live, everything will have been brought into the sprints and completed.
Okay.
Now, that's not go ahead.
So that takes care of leveling out the change and making it sort of a constant process. How do you actually get change requests in? When does it occur?
Well, I'm going back to how we started this conversation. We have made allowances in this contract for unanticipated changes. And right now, going through this particular state's legislature, there are bills that are going through that will affect the product that we're working on right now. And so when they get enacted and signed off by the governor, those changes will very quickly come to us. So they are not in the original scope. No amount of user stories describe those changes that are coming from the legislature. So in those cases, we will bring those in as formal change requests, formalized much like we described earlier in this podcast. They will get approved, and then they will get slotted according to priority into some sprint. They'll go through a discovery process, user stories will be built. And then if we have to move some user stories that are less important out of the sprint and put these in, or if we have to bring on a whole new sprint team, we will, but it's going to be a change request from that sort of perspective.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things I do in a less complex and a less enterprise level project would be building that formal process that everybody commits to, and also ensuring, through communication and through education, that here's how we receive those changes. Part of Agile is all of these silly ceremonies they have. And I found that using stand-ups and reviews and retrospectives and using them as constant flows of information help us to actually understand change and the impact of change a lot better. They're short, they're quick, and they provide not just changes that are necessary or changes that need to be approved, but also these constant innovations that the clients are coming up with, the team's coming up with, and we're coming up with.
So if I'm in an IT shop within an organization and I'm developing a project that the CEO has said, yeah, we need to have it done by this date. Mm-hmm. But then that CEO's senior leadership is offering a change here or a change there. And I can see in an agile process where they can continue on making those changes, moving things in and out of sprints to satisfy what the leadership is asking for. And in my way of thinking, it's less stressful perhaps than the fixed price for profit projects that I just described. Does that make sense, or does that?
Yes, it does. Now, here's the secret. Okay, it's less stressful and everybody's more comfortable because it has that flow that operations has, and it's closer to an operational model of change. But at the same time, there has to be that firm formal adoption of impact analysis, and it has to be a communication that's totally transparent. You can't shy away. You can't miss a few meetings. You have to have a voice. And this is where I've seen Agile stumble in a lot of corporations. The expectations of the stakeholders, especially executives. Do you mean I have to have input here? You mean you're going to be bothering me? Yes. If you want this project to be successful, we need your voice.
Well, otherwise the project becomes a never-ending project of continuous improvements, continuous enhancements, I have a better idea. Mm-hmm. But what happens if you're trying to put a product out to beat your competitors? Then the CEO chose that date because that's the date that product needs to be to market before the competitors are. So then it's much like the fixed price projects that I described in the organizations that I've been working for.
Yeah, and that's where, again, this impact analysis and the theory of constraints are your best buddies when you're defending your position in a meeting like that.
I had an interesting conversation with a project that I was advising not so long ago, and it was one of those situations where, well, what happens if we end up bringing a very large change but don't move the end date? What will you do, Mr. System Integrator? And the answer was, we'll just bring on another sprint team. And I was kind of satisfied with that, thinking, wow, you guys are, if you guys have that capacity, that ability, that's great. But then I thought, wait a minute, a new sprint team has no institutional knowledge of the project that has been going on for a while. So there has to be some ramp up time. So I don't think that necessarily just bringing on another agile team, another sprint team is going to solve every problem.
And once you hear somebody say just, you know they haven't thought through the process.
Yeah.
That word just is like, okay, they filed it for future reference.
Yeah.
They have not thought it through.
Plus, how many corporations, system integrators and not, just have this entirely huge bench of sprint teams just ready to plug into a project.
And yeah, they expect that the components and the functions and everything are going to be pristine. Yeah. And they think that all the risk has been managed properly up to that point. And this is where, you know, we have to set that expectation. There are durations in not just the ramp up you're talking about, but, you know, how are we going to work together to actually pull this thing to its conclusion?
Well, and even that second sprint team, once it's ramped up, still has to have functional intersection with what the other team is working on. So it's not like you can work in a silo.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about Agile. You have these small pieces of work that can be run somewhat independently, but the expectation is that everybody is going to be communicating and engaging together. And it sounds like, you know, you have two thought processes going at the same time, but this is what we call self-organizing. And it has to be in this way for Agile to work really well.
So if you were a newer project manager listening to us right now, have we missed anything in terms of how to handle this complex process called change management or change control?
The big things that the new project managers ask are, like I said, who makes the changes? And I think we've covered that. What does a change control process look like? And we've covered that. And the whole difference between agile and predictive. And I hope we painted a really good picture there. What is your thinking?
I'm thinking, yes, I'm thinking that, well, especially in the last topic that you just mentioned, I think in the predictive process, change control makes more sense, because you've kind of predicted what your schedule is going to look like from now until the end of the project. And so therefore, if I insert this change, large or small, it will have a ripple effect on every component that I talked about earlier, including potentially the end date. So I think it's much more easy to visualize change control in a predictive project than it is in an agile project. But that doesn't mean that change control isn't just as important, just as formalized in Agile.
Very good. Very good. You know, I was thinking about this. There is one thing that I'd like to add here before we conclude. When do you start talking about change? The very beginning of the project. That's one thing I'd like to actually communicate to. When do I start introducing my team and my stakeholders to change management? And it's change management is not just a set of processes in the plan, it's part of the culture. So you want to start as early as possible and set that expectation, not just with your team, but your stakeholders. Here's how change is going to occur. If you want what you desire, we're going to have this level of change management.
Actually, that's important. The project that I'm advising on currently, one of the very first deliverables from the system integrator was a project management plan. And if I'm a fairly new project manager listening to this, I'm thinking, oh, a Gantt chart, schedule, predecessors, all of those sorts of things, lag, and all of those sorts of things that go in. No. That was only one component. There are 11 other components to the full plan, in our case, one of which is what you just described, is how to go about dealing with changes. It's called a change management plan as part of the overall project master plan.
Right, right. And like you said, just because agile may not be as formal doesn't mean change and thinking about change and building change into the culture is not critical.
Well, and if you're a system integrator, and this is, I can speak to this a lot because I've been many of these times. If in the prospectus to bid, someone says we need these 50 reports. And when I get into the discovery process with my client and they say, oh, we missed 50, you actually have 100 reports. I have a change. Whether you like it or not, those extra 50 reports, I don't care how good my reporting process is, it's still going to take time, effort, analysis, everything else. That's a change, agile
Right,
or not.
right. And that's the beautiful thing of it. And whether it's agile or predictive, you want to capture this understanding as early as possible. In predictive projects, you know pretty much how things are going to go. And so you can gather these requirements so that you don't have to make changes later on. And in agile, you're creating these pieces of work that we'll call features or sprints or whatever you want to call them that you use to explore so you can find these things before you start working on them and have to make the change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So in the couple of minutes we have left, and we have a couple of minutes left, what do we think we should leave with young, up and coming, budding project managers who, by the way, when they become good, they will make us look like amateurs, Tim. But when these young people come forward, how would you advise them to start studying or preparing or doing whatever for some of these major projects when they become involved as project managers?
Number one, understand your organization's process for change.
Yeah.
Even if it's not explicit, even if it's tacit, find out how your organization makes changes and document it. And if they already have it documented, embrace that. Do not reinvent the wheel for change management. Use what your organization has. And when you go into a client, if you're a consultant, use the organization, the client's organization, as the template for change and change management. You don't want to have to be teaching people how to manage change, and how to participate in change, if at all possible. You want it to make it real easy for them, and also talk about it constantly. And use it as a focus of one of your topics on your regular meetings. Here are the changes, here's the top 3 changes, here's the top issues, here are the top risks, and here's how we're working through them. And also make sure that when you have a change, you know exactly, how the process is to, document that change, analyze that change, dispense with that change, and then make sure it's applied and validated.
Especially the validation piece.
Oh boy, we didn't talk about that enough, did we? Yeah,
Probably
I usually wax poetic about validation.
And the other part is make sure that your sponsor, your client executive are involved in those decisions. Don't ever, as a project manager, be in the situation where you are making the financial decision on behalf of the organization, because that's not your pocketbook that you're playing with. So
yeah, it's the role of the project manager to advise.
yes.
You don't need to ask questions. You don't need to make decisions. You advise and you facilitate and you give people who make the decisions the information they need to make those decisions with authority and effectively.
What's kind of funny today was knowing that we had this topic on change management probably had my antenna up a little bit. And I was flipping through social media this morning and I came across the quote. I lost it, but let me present it as I remember it. It sort of said something along the lines, we all know that change is inevitable. We live with that every day, right? Change is inevitable. Yet why do we fear that it's going to happen? If we know it's going to happen, why do we fear it?
Yeah, we could talk about this. There's a lot of knowledge about human behavior and group behavior that looks for keep the business running in stasis. Even though it will never occur, we have this drive to create a static environment so that we can actually continue to feel safe and relax and enjoy ourselves. But it's chasing a brass ring that always is going to be out of reach.
If we didn't embrace change, we'd still be cooking our kill over a fire in our backyards.
I'm happy we have this change. I'm not an early adopter, but I do embrace change when I've had the time to analyze and really think about it well.
And then I also came across the quote, and I'm going to leave you with this one to think about. It's actually an ancient quote. I forgot exactly. Herodotus, one of those guys back in ancient Greek culture said this: "You can never step into the same river twice."
That was my favorite. Marcus Aurelius. Yeah.
Oh, was it Aurelius? Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
You're a different person. And the water's different. No matter how many times you walk into a river, you never step into the same river twice.
And that's what change management, you just think of it. That has to be your attitude. You never step into the same river twice.
We'll make a stoic of you yet.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Where can we find you this week, Tim?
I'm over at LinkedIn. I'm actually closing out some of my work, so you'll see me a little bit more visible here in the next 4 weeks as we ramp down to the holidays. And you, Merv?
Yeah, that's where I like to have my discussions, on LinkedIn as well. So find us there. Yep.
Okay. Thanks again, Merv. This has been very enjoyable.
Yeah.
And anybody tuning in or listening to the recording, add your comments or questions, and you know where to find us.
Great. Until next week.
Thanks again.